Dr. Peter Kreeft is a professor of philosophy at Boston College and the King's College. He is the author of numerous books on philosophy, theology, and apologetics, as well as a much sought-after lecturer and debater. Dr. Kreeft went to Calvin College and received his master's degree and PhD at Fordham. He also briefly did postgraduate studies at Yale University. Dr. Kreeft joined the philosophy faculty of Boston College in 1965. His intellectual reputation stems from his strengths in debating and summarizing the philosophical arguments of the major Western philosophers. He has debated several academics and issues related to God's existence. Shortly after he began teaching at Boston College, he was challenged to a debate on the existence of God between himself and Paul Brines, an atheist and a history professor, which was attended by a majority of the undergraduate students. Kreeft later used many of the arguments in this debate to create the Handbook of Christian Apologetics with his then undergraduate student, Ronald Tacelli. Dr. Kreeft has received several honors for achievements in philosophical reasoning, including the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, the Yale Sterling Fellowship, the Newman Alumni Scholarship, the Danforth Asian Religions Fellowship, and the Wethersfield Homeland Foundation Fellowship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Kreeft.
The original title I was given was Supernatural Matters, and then I was told to focus on the existence of God, because that's obviously the primary supernatural matter. But a general point first, the master heresy in our culture and in our time, which many of the popes have called modernism, is naturalism. Naturalism means there is no such thing as the supernatural, there is only nature, that is, the universe. Carl Sagan, for instance, defines the cosmos as all that ever was, is, or will be. That cultural assumption of naturalism infects a lot of elements of our religion. You've probably heard people say, yes, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I believe in a God, but God is simply all the good in everybody. And yes, I believe in miracles, but every sunset and every baby is a miracle. And yes, I believe in the Bible, but it's just useful myths. And I believe in angels, but they're just good human beings. And I believe in sin, but that's just inappropriate behavior. And the fear of the Lord is not the beginning of wisdom. It's a terrible thing. Well, that gives you another religion. That's not Christianity. That's humanism. That's self-worship. That's the devil's religion. Those who enter hell sing the anthem of that religion, I did it my way. Those that sing heaven, enter heaven, sing God's way is the best way. Those are two very different religions. Well, what's the origin of naturalism? Why is it so popular, even among so-called religious people? Well, one very obvious answer is prestige. It's the establishment religion in our secular culture. It's still not that fashionable to be an aggressive atheist, but it's also unfashionable to be an aggressive theist. So something nice and wishy-washy in the middle. A religion where God is like a book on the shelf, and on a beautiful day when you want him, you can take him down, but when he's uncomfortable, you just put him back. But that just raises another question. If the main motive why religious people water down their religion to a naturalistic religion, why is that prestigious in the first place? Why is our culture naturalistic? And the answer that's usually given is to be scientifically respectable, the so-called war between science and religion, which is supposed to be the main reason for the decline of religion throughout the last 3 or 4 centuries in the history of Western civilization. I announced to you the astonishing truth that there is no such thing. The war between science and religion has no more reality than Santa Claus. It does not exist. And if people tell you that science has disproved religion, please ask them which discovery of which science, made when, with which proof, logically disproves the doctrine of which religion. And they'll never be able to answer it. It's just a vague climate of opinion. There has never been, throughout the history of the world, a single doctrine of our religion that has ever been refuted by any scientific discovery whatsoever. That's amazing, because our religion is vulnerable to scientific disproof. It's not just a series of platitudes which can't be disproved, like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. If the bones of the dead Jesus were discovered in some tomb in Israel tomorrow, Christianity would be definitively refuted, blown away. Nothing like that has ever happened. There is a second reason in our culture, I think, which is even stronger for the decline of religion, and that's not just due to something new in our culture, that's due to something perennial in human nature, namely the desire to be God, the desire to be on your own, the desire to be free, the desire not to knuckle under any higher power. And that's why it's not so much in theology, but in ethics that dissent or rebellion exists, especially in sexual ethics. The rest of morality is still fairly well in place in Western civilization, but if it has anything to do with sex, it's a sort of anything goes. That chaos, like any heresy, is always addressed by the church. The church always has an answer to the different wounds that the patients come to it with, because the church is a hospital. And John Paul II's theology of the body, if you don't know it, is something you absolutely must know in order to give the true big picture of sex and sexual morality. But let's do what you're expecting me to do. Let's look at just how faith and reason are, as John Paul II famously said, two wings of the same bird, and how the church speaks two languages, the language of faith and the language of reason. And to the world, the church speaks the language of reason. So what are the rational arguments for the reality of the supernatural? When people speak of the supernatural, they usually think of spectacular things like miracles, life after death, heaven and hell, the authority of the church, the infallibility of Scripture, and maybe most deeply of all, whether God is really in charge of our lives, divine providence. Can God solve even the problem of evil? Those are all consequences of the naturalism versus supernaturalism issue. For instance, if there is no God, then the closest thing you get to God is yourself, and you're in charge of your life, and you're doing a pretty lousy job of it, let's be frank. I love the book of Job, especially because of one word. Job is sitting on a dung heap. You know what dung means? It's the S word. And it happens, and life is full of it. That's in the New Testament too, by the way. One of my favorite verses. It's very funny. It's in Philippians. Paul goes through all of his worldly, prestigious pluses. He's a Pharisee of the Pharisees, as to the law, blameless. He's a Roman citizen. He's educated by Gamaliel, the greatest of rabbis. All of this, compared with knowing Jesus Christ, he says, is skubala. Most of our politically correct Bible translations translate that as refuse or garbage. It's the S word. And the great question of human life is, can you trust God with that? Is there a God who knows so much more than you do that if he were to appear and speak to you as he did to Job, the best thing he could possibly say was the two things he said to St. Catherine in a mystical vision. He said, you only need to know two things, and all of divine revelation is about these two things, and if you fully understand these two things, you understand it all. This is all that I'm trying to get across throughout the Bible. Number one, I'm God. Number two, you're not. We keep forgetting that second thing. Well, those are all the practical payoffs of the existence of God. But is it reasonable to believe that there is a God? Eminently so. There are scads and scads of arguments for the existence of God. There's only one good argument against the existence of God, and that's the problem of evil. But there are dozens of arguments for the existence of God. Let me divide them into 4 categories. The first category is, I think, a weak argument which doesn't convince anybody, but it's very clever. It's traditionally called the Ontological Argument, first formulated by St. Anselm in the 12th century. And it goes something like this. The definition of God, whether he exists or not, is the being with all conceivable perfections. But to really exist outside the mind is more perfect than to exist only as a myth inside the mind. Therefore, by definition, God must exist. Instinctively, we know there's a fallacy there somewhere, although it's very hard logically to find it. So let's just skip that argument and talk about a second class of probable arguments or inductive arguments. Arguments from facts that strongly point to the existence of God but don't conclusively prove it. By the way, most arguments are like that. Most of what we think we know with probability. For instance, you're not absolutely certain that I'm not a homicidal maniac about to pull out a pistol and kill you. But it's very improbable, so you took a chance in coming here. One of these probable arguments has been called the argument from common consent. It's estimated that somewhere between 95% and 99% of all the human beings who have ever lived on this planet, in all times, places, cultures, and religions, have believed in some sort of superhuman higher power, or God, by per a very broad definition. So if there is no God, then 99% of all human beings are insane. They're like Jimmy Stewart in that old movie, Harvey. Harvey is a 13-foot-high invisible rabbit that only Jimmy Stewart can see, and he's the most important person in Jimmy Stewart's life. And in every other way, Jimmy is a normal, nice guy, but he strongly believes in Harvey. Well, he's nuts. Well, God's even bigger than Harvey and more important than Harvey. So if there's no God, then only the atheists are sane among us. Now, maybe there's no conclusive proof that that's not so, but you've got to be awfully arrogant to believe it. So the price you pay for disbelieving in God is you can't join the rest of the human race. You have to look down on them as idiots. That's quite a price. A second probable argument is a very famous one, probably you've heard it, Pascal's Wager. It's addressed to skeptics who aren't sure whether God exists or not. Well, if you're not certain, you might have to wager. So let's see what you can gain and what you can lose. If God exists and you bet for him, you can gain everything. And if you bet against him, you can lose everything. But if God doesn't exist, you can't gain or lose anything because there's no God and no heaven to gain or lose. So your only chance of winning is to believe, and your only chance of losing is to disbelieve. That's very crass and selfish and crude, and it's not truly religious faith, but it might scare the atheist off his butt. God's not going to be satisfied with that. That's not a very high motive for religious faith, a kind of eternal fire insurance policy. But still, it's something. A third probable argument is all the miracles in human history. If with an open mind you go through history and look at miracles, if you take a trip to Mexico City and examine the tilma of Juan Diego, if you go to Italy once every 5 years and watch the blood of St. Januarius miraculously liquefy in the public square, if you go to Lourdes and interview people who have been miraculously healed there, you'll at least be discombobulated if you're an atheist. How do you explain them? Well, if you don't want to believe, you can explain them in some other way. Jesus himself says in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, even if someone were to rise from the dead, they still wouldn't believe because they don't want to. But if you're open-minded, that's powerful evidence. A fourth piece of evidence is the history of the Catholic Church. There has been no other institution in history that has been so consistent and so pure in its teaching, despite the fact of radical impurity among its people. Napoleon kidnapped the Pope, brought him to France, and said, "We will destroy your church." And the Pope said, "If we Italians haven't been able to destroy it for 19 centuries, you're not going to do it either." That's a good argument. Look what we've endured. A fifth probable argument is the effects that religious belief produce in people's lives. Psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, who are some of the most secular and atheist people in any profession, routinely recommend religious belief to their patients because they see that it makes them happy, well integrated, full of hope and purpose. It works. Well, if it makes you holy and happy, but it's false, then the human heart, the human spirit, which is what psychoanalysts are supposed to be investigating, is torn apart in opposite directions. The two best things in your life, goodness and truth, lead you in opposite directions. That's quite a price to pay. And look at all the saints. Are they the stupidest people in the world? Does being really good make you really stupid? Look at Jesus Christ. No one ever had more faith than he. Is he the stupidest person who ever lived? That's quite a price to pay. Honest atheists, like Camus, worry about that. One of my favorite atheist characters in literature is Dr. Roux in his novel The Plague. He's an atheist, but he risks his life to save thousands of people from the plague because he knows that the meaning of life is to be a saint. But he can't figure out how you can possibly be a saint with no God, and he doesn't believe there's God. And he never solved that dilemma, and neither did Camus. You've got to admire his honesty. Honest atheists are unhappy. Dishonest atheists are happy. Makes a big difference. Jesus didn't say, by the way, that all atheists go to hell and all theists go to heaven. He said, all who seek, find. All who honestly seek the truth will find it. If not in this life, then in the next. Well, a third class of arguments for the existence of God are much more familiar, especially if you've studied Thomas Aquinas. They're called cosmological arguments, arguments from the cosmos. Arguments are classified by where they start, where their data come from, where their premises come from. And the most certain premises come from our experience, because all our knowledge begins with experience, especially with sense experience. You can't deny, for instance, that things move, that things change. So his first, and he thinks most certain argument, is the argument from that fact. Things move. Well, so what? Well, if there's no first mover, no unmoved mover, no first cause, then there can't be second causes or third causes or fourth causes or any number, even if it's an infinite number. Because motion or change is a one-way thing. If A changes B, that doesn't mean at the same time B changes A. If domino A pushes domino B down, that doesn't mean that domino B at the same time pushes domino A down, the opposite. Well, we see that there is an incredibly complex chain of interacting dominoes, so to speak, in the universe. So there must be a first. And the first, by definition, is not something that's dependent on something before it, because there is nothing before it. So this intuitively looks like a very good argument. There must be some sort of first cause. That's not, of course, all that you mean by God. That's a very thin slice of God, but it's enough to refute the atheist. A second argument expands the data from change to existence. Things exist, and things give existence to other things. For instance, your parents are responsible for the fact that you exist in the world. So existence is passed down the chain from causes to effects throughout history. Well, you can't give what you don't have. Suppose I said, I'll give you a book that will be so clear that you'll understand all the mysteries of Catholic theology in 10 minutes. And you would say, please give me that book. and I say, well, I don't have it. I have to borrow it from my wife. Well, does she have it? No, she has to borrow it from the library. Does the library have it? No, it has to get it from interlibrary loan. Well, can interlibrary loan get it? Well, they have to borrow it from, well, does anybody have it? Well, no, nobody has it. Well, then nobody's going to get it. Well, existence is like that book. If we get it, if it's passed down the chain, then somebody must have it to begin with. But a being that simply has existence and doesn't get it is an eternal being, and that's God. There's no other candidate. A third argument is the argument from contingency. Everything can cease to exist. Nothing has to be. We're all great might not have beens. Well, if everything is contingent, on what is it contingent? If everything can die and there's no God and no act of creation and therefore the universe is eternal, there's been enough time for everything to die. How come it's still there? That's a more abstract argument. A fourth one, the argument from degrees of perfection, assumes something that most philosophers today deny, but most commonsensical people believe, namely that when we make value judgments, we're talking sense, not nonsense, and we're talking about objective truth, not just subjective feelings, that human beings really are more perfect than oysters. If you don't believe that, please don't invite me to your house, because you're either a cannibal or a vegetarian. If one thing is really more perfect than another, there must be an absolute standard by which you judge that. 3 is a higher number than 2 because it's closer to infinity. No finite number is infinity, but that standard must be valid in order to be used. Maybe nobody will get 100 on my test, but 99 is higher than 98 because it's closer to 100. So on the assumption that our value judgments, at least sometimes, are objectively true, the degrees of perfection that exist in the universe mean that there must be some absolute standard, some most perfect being, and that's one of the definitions of God. The fifth argument is the most popular of all. You find this in all primitive cultures. It's called the argument from design, or from order in nature. We couldn't design anything as remotely perfect as nature. And the more science discovers nature and its laws, the more amazingly intelligent design we see there. The concept of design is not something that hard science can define or verify. You can't quantify it. So I don't think this is a scientific proof for the existence of God, but it's certainly a good philosophical proof for the existence of God, because obviously nature is not random merely, and when it is random, it's designed randomness, like a roulette wheel. So the order in nature pretty clearly and immediately bespeaks some sort of a mind. Think of the human brain, the most complex piece of matter we know in the universe. It enables you to think. It's very much like a supercomputer. When I was flying here yesterday, I heard a public address system say over the airplane, the pilot and the co-pilot have just died, but don't worry, nothing to worry about because the plane is on autopilot, and the autopilot has been programmed by a computer, which in turn has been programmed by a random fall of hailstones on the keyboard left out at a football field overnight. I would, of course, lie back in my seat and smile and say everything's going to be all right, right? Of course not. Of course not. Computers work only because there's an intelligent mind that programs them. Well, our brain is like a computer. And if there's nothing but random chance and blind, unintelligent forces of natural selection that programmed our brains to come into existence, why do we trust them for anything, including science and talking about brains? A fourth and most interesting class of arguments could be called psychological arguments. All our experience is two-poled. That is, there's a subject and an object. There's an experiencer and an experienced thing. There's a knower and a known. And the modern mind is much more interested in the subjective, the psychological, than the ancient mind was. Probably because we're teenagers now. Little kids say, what's that, what's that, what's that? But teenagers say, who am I? Do people love me? Do I have zits? What's the meaning of my life? Shall I commit suicide? Am I ugly? Well, that's us. It's a natural development. It's neither good nor bad. So it's these arguments that intrigue us the most. One of them is the fact that we have minds at all, that what exists in human experience is not just matter, but also mind, reason, human reason. We can know a lot about the universe. We can do science. It's spectacularly successful. We're rightly proud of it. But science always expresses itself, or tries to express itself, in universal formulas, like force equals mass times acceleration, or energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So we can know universal truths about nature. Well, that proves that reason transcends nature, because the knowledge of something can't be one of the parts of that something. If I know this microphone, I'm not an atom in the microphone. I'm something over and above the microphone. But I can know something about all of nature. Therefore, there's something that transcends nature, at least when people know nature by reason. So at least materialistic naturalism is overcome by that argument. Even though that doesn't prove a God, it opens the door to a God. Some of the truths that we know are not just temporal, but eternal, necessary. 2 + 2 = 4 in any possible universe. How can there be eternal truths unless there's an eternal mind? Aren't we reading the mind of God when we know that 2 and 2 are 4? That everything is what it is and not what it isn't. That can't ever be changed. That's eternal. But our minds are not eternal. They keep changing. And our minds are not infallible. They keep making mistakes. But when we know that a thing is what it is, we know something that's eternal and unchangeable and infallible. It looks as if we're in touch with the divine mind. Much more interesting than these intellectual arguments are moral arguments. The moral argument for the existence of God is very simple. Dostoevsky put it this way: if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. That is, if there is a moral law, which is truly moral, it's not just something we made up like the rules of the game, because then you wouldn't feel guilty about changing the rules. You decide to play 9 innings of baseball, you're tired after 6 innings, so you go home without any feeling of guilt. But thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not steal are not like that. They're absolute commands. They're duties. They produce obligation in you. Well, if there's a real law, there must be a lawgiver. A law is an expression of a will. What lies behind a law, if it impinges upon my will, is some other will. Well, what will could that be? Another fallible human will? That would not produce this infallible obligation. The problem with this argument is moral relativism, a genuine infection in our culture. Cardinal Newman, back in the 19th century, already dealt with the problem of moral relativism, which infects mainly intellectuals. We have a saying in academia, that idea is so insane you have to have 2 PhDs to believe it. Cardinal Newman amended the moral argument to appeal even to moral relativists who say there's no 10 commandments, different strokes for different folks. The only thing that I have to worry about is being true to myself and my own private conscience. He said, well, do you think it is ever morally right for anyone to deliberately disobey his own private conscience? To be hypocritical and insincere? No, that's the one absolute. Well, where does that come from? What gives conscience such authority? You're treating your conscience as if it's a prophet of Almighty God. If there's no God, why do that? If conscience is just the voice of society, why are you treating society as God? If conscience is just what your parents want, why are you treating your parents as God? If conscience is just your animal instincts, why are you treating that as God? If conscience is just what happened to evolve this way, why are you treating that as God? That can be a dangerous argument because it can produce the opposite result from what you want. If God does not exist, everything is permissible. It's assumed that you're sane enough to say not everything is permissible, therefore God exists. But you might say, you know, you're right, God does not exist, and therefore everything is permissible. The hell with morality. I'll perform a conscienceectomy on myself. So you got to watch out who you use that on. I was teaching ethics once at Boston College, and I had two very intelligent, strong, radical feminists in the front row, and we were talking about abortion, and I challenged them to give me a single argument that would justify abortion that would not also justify infanticide. Why do you suddenly get a right to life when the two blades of the obstetrician's scissors meet when they cut the umbilical cord? And they tried to answer the question, and I thought I refuted their answers pretty well. And after class, they came up to me and said, "Professor, congratulations, we didn't think you could do it. You changed our minds. You're very rational." I said, "Oh, good, you're pro-life now?" "No, we're pro-infanticide." I didn't think it was funny at the time. We've talked about two psychological arguments from reason or the intellect and two from the will and morality. There's a third thing in the human soul that distinguishes us from the animals, and that's the heart. There's an argument from beauty that I think is very impressive on modern people. In fact, in the Handbook of Christian Apologetics, I have 20 arguments for the existence of God, and I routinely ask students which is their favorite argument, and almost always the most popular one is the shortest one. There is the music of Bach, therefore there must be a God, period. End of story. You either see that or you don't. I personally know 3 ex-atheists who were converted by the music of Bach. Well, as I said, that's one you either see or you don't. But probably the most interesting argument of all is the argument made popular by C.S. Lewis. It's often called the argument from desire. If you look at the human heart, you find that it desires all sorts of things. And you can classify desires as either natural and innate and universal human desires that everybody has in all times and places and cultures, or artificial desires that are stimulated by advertising or things you see in your life but not in somebody else's life. For instance, there's the desire for the Red Sox to win the World Series again, which exists in Boston but not Washington. There's a desire to go to the land of Oz, if you like the movie. A desire to fly through the air like Superman, if you've ever seen Superman. Those are not universal desires. They don't come from human nature. They come from outside. But there are a number of desires that everybody has. Hunger. We want food. Thirst. We want drink. Sexual desire. We want sexual happiness. We're lonely. We want friends. We're curious. We want knowledge. We want to see beauty, not ugliness. We want a good conscience, not a bad conscience. We want other people to love us, not hate us. Every human being who ever lived has those desires. All right, look at all the other natural desires, the ones I just mentioned, and one thing common to all of them is that they correspond to something real. If there is a hunger, there must be a food. Suppose you went to some other planet and you found that there were some beings there that were like robots. They didn't have carbon-based life forms, but they were constantly getting hungry for steak. But they had no stomachs that could digest steak. That would make no sense at all. Or suppose these extraterrestrials were monosexual beings, a race of Romeos without Juliets, but they were constantly falling in love with non-existent Juliets. That would make no sense at all. So every one of these natural desires corresponds to something real. That's why it exists. Hunger means food. Now, if you examine your heart, if you're totally honest with yourself, you have to admit that you're unhappy. Nobody is totally, completely happy. You get little bits of happiness, and they're like appetizers, and you want the meal. But nobody's ever eaten the meal in this life. What we want is indescribable. If you call it God, you can't define that. If you call it heaven and you make pictures of heaven, they're silly pictures. Write down a list of all the things you want to be in heaven and then imagine yourself getting them for all eternity. How long would it take for you to be bored? Not too long. So we can't understand our own hearts. We can't understand what we desire. Maybe heaven's a myth. Maybe we made it up. All right. But we want something eye has not seen and ear has not heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man. We all want that, if we're totally honest. We might think it's impossible, it doesn't exist, we can't ever get it, but we'd like it. We'd like there to be a movie about heaven so fascinating that you want to see it over and over again forever. Never been such a movie. Never been an even good one. Interestingly, there have been interesting movies about hell, but not about heaven. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that we're better at imagining villains than heroes for most of our fiction. But in any case, we all want something that's beyond our understanding. And that's an innate desire. Whenever we experience a tremendous joy, it always seems as if it's a pointing finger, pointing beyond itself, as if it's the smell of a food we haven't quite digested yet. All right, what does that mean? Well, put the two premises together. Every natural desire corresponds to a reality. We have a natural desire for something that we call God. Conclusion, God corresponds to a reality. Doesn't mean you're going to get him. You might die of starvation, but it means that he exists. That argument not only, I think, proves the existence of God, but reorders our lives, because our lives are really governed not primarily by our reason, maybe they should be, but by our hearts, by our desires. Our reason itself is directed by our desire. Think about this. Why? Because it's interesting. Because I want to. Desire is like the captain of the ship, and reason is like the navigator. And they should respect each other. The captain should listen to the navigator, but he has the power of saying, I don't want to listen to you. Throw your charts overboard. So our hearts can be stupid, or they can be wise, but they're really the boss. So this is, in one sense, the primary argument from within, because the heart is, well, the heart, the primary organ. To get rid of this argument, the atheist has to say that, well, all the other desires do correspond to realities, but this big one doesn't. In that case, life is something like the following very bad joke. A father was trying to teach his son life's most important lesson. And he said, son, what are you most afraid of? And the boy, who was about 5 years old, said, high places. So the father said, see that 10-foot-high wall? Go climb up on that wall. Oh, Daddy, I'm afraid. This is why you have to do it. Okay, now what? Now jump. Oh, I can't do that. Yes, you can. Why? I'll catch you. Promise? Yes. Promise? Yes. Okay, here I come. Oh, you caught me. Thank you, Daddy. Can we go home now? No. One more time. 15-foot-high wall. Daddy, I can't do it. Yes, you can. Remember the 10-foot-high wall? I promise I'll catch you. Okay, here I come. Oh, thank you for catching me, Daddy. Can we go home? No. One more time. 20-foot-high wall. Can't do it, Daddy. Yes, you can. Do you promise you'll catch me? Yes. Cross your heart and hope to die? Yes. Okay, here I come. Wee, splat. Ah, Daddy, why did you catch me? To teach you the most important lesson in human life, son. Never trust anybody, not even your father. Well, that's what life is like if there's no God and no heaven. Because God says, trust me in this. There's hunger, there's food. And it's true. And here's the biggest hunger of all. And there's no food for it? That's like somebody starving, walking into a restaurant where it advertises free food, and there's a whole bunch of appetizers, and each appetizer makes you more hungry for the main course, and now when the main course comes, it's nothing. It's empty. Well, in that case, naturalism isn't true, because the world is governed by a supreme intelligence that is diabolical. In other words, that argument proves that God is the devil. And if the food exists, then God is God. But in any case, there's got to be a God. He's either trustable or he's not. There's much too much design in every area of human life to believe there's no God. So the fundamental choice is not so much a choice whether you follow the argument or not, and end up with an absolute being. The fundamental choice is the nature of that absolute being. Can you trust him? Throughout the Bible, you don't find arguments for the existence of God. In fact, disbelief in the existence of God is mentioned only once in the Bible, in the psalm that says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Of course there's a God. The big question is, can you trust him? It certainly doesn't look like you can. The world is full of scubala. Why did Jesus Christ come? To show us two things, John Paul II says, the two most important things in human life, who we are and who God is. Jesus Christ showed us that God is infinite love and infinitely trustable. He came to feed us with his own body and blood. You can't be more loving than that. And then he showed us who we are. We're supposed to be little Christs. Well, those are the two supreme answers to the two supreme questions. The reason arguments for the existence of God are important is that they give for the atheist a reason to avoid those two questions. But once you've overcome that, once you've made theism a possibility, then the even bigger question arises. Do you trust him? Do you love him? Do you jump? And that's the fundamental question of human life. So please jump, please be a saint, please save the world.